started. And I would like to welcome you all again to the CoSA member webinar. Today's topic is looking to 2022, federal record-keeping policies in an era of transition. And so what we're going to do is we're going to hear a presentation from our speaker, and then we'll have a question and answer period, and of course talk about upcoming programs and webinars that we have so you can stay in touch. Well, I'm pleased to tell you that today our speaker is Jason R. Barron. And prior to entering private practice at Fager Drinker LLP, Mr. Barron served as the first appointed Director of Litigation at the U.S. National Archives and Records Administration. And before that, as a trial lawyer and senior counsel in the U.S. Department of Justice. In those capacities, Mr. Barron played a leading role in the government's adoption of electronic record-keeping practices and acted as lead counsel in landmark cases involving the preservation of White House email. He is the lead author of the book Perspectives on Predictive Coding and Other Advanced Search Techniques for the Legal Practitioner. He has written over 100 published articles on subjects related to e-discovery and information governance and has made over 600 presentations worldwide. In addition to awards during his time in public service, Mr. Barron was the 2013 recipient of the Justice Tom C. Clark Outstanding Government Lawyer Award given by the Federal Bar Association and the International Emmett Leahy Award for his career contributions in records and information management. He was prominently featured in the documentary The Decades of Discovery, which tells the story of a government lawyer seeking a better way to search for White House email. The American Lawyer magazine named him one of 6 e-discovery trailblazers in its 2013 issue devoted to the top 50 big law innovations of the last 50 years. In connection with electronic record-keeping controversies, Mr. Barron has appeared on NBC News, Good Morning America, MSNBC, CNN, and NPR's All Things Considered, has been quoted in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Time Magazine, and numerous other media outlets. He received his BA, magna cum laude, with honors from Wesleyan University, and his JD from Boston University School of Law. And with that, I would like to, and by the way, Terry Martin was scheduled to be our moderator today, but I could not, so this is just Lisa Johnston moderating for you today. So now we'll turn it over to Jason.
Hey, thanks. Thanks very much, Lisa. I want to thank CoSA. I want to thank Barbara Teague for getting me involved in CoSA last year with a statement that I'm going to talk about. I must say that I realize it's a very challenging time today and this week and this month. So you're all very dedicated to sign in and talk and hear about, and for all of us to discuss archives and record-keeping issues and federal record-keeping issues. I spent 33 years in the government, and I think the 13 years as Director of Litigation at the National Archives were my happiest years. I'm not saying that just because I know that Gary Stern is one of the attendees to this webinar, who is my boss as General Counsel. Anyway, let's get started. So let me see if I can do this. All right, we're going to look to 2022 and beyond. My purpose here is to have a conversation with everyone who's working in state government, give you what I think are really interesting and important initiatives that NAGARA and the federal government are doing related to record keeping. But I want to think larger than record keeping, so we're going to have a conversation that embraces a couple of newer concepts about data as well. So we'll just for a moment talk about state and local issues, which in my mind are very much similar to what the federal experience is in terms of record keeping and archives. And then we'll go through a couple of new OMB memos that came out last year and their import and what it means going forward. We'll touch on a couple of NAGARA initiatives that NAGARA people, when they show up at SAA and CoSA, go on at great length and do a wonderful job explaining, but we'll just touch on those. I don't claim to be as much a subject matter expert as my NAGARA colleagues, but I think they're important. I do know something about Capstone email and about electronic messaging, and so I want to talk about that. I think that's still, email's still important, and what is emerging is really important. And then I'll give some thoughts about FOIA access and records and new technologies. I have the privilege to sit on the FOIA Advisory Committee to the Archivist for this term, and we're preparing a final report. And I'll touch on that as well. So here we go. You all work in state government, and there's an information governance landscape here that, in my mind, is very similar. But the challenges are very similar at the state government level and the federal government level. Yes, there are hundreds of federal agencies that report into the National Archives, but so the scope, the scale is bigger. But we all are experiencing the same kind of issues in terms of record status of new forms of communication, email, and we'll talk about electronic messaging and other technologies, working with stakeholders, especially with IT staff, to make sure that they have an awareness, a consciousness of electronic record keeping during procurements and otherwise, ensuring that permanent records in the state level are transferred to archives with the right formatting, the right metadata. You all have FOI laws to consider, very much like FOIA, and there are privacy and security considerations. And we all are in the process. In private practice, the last 6 years, I've been working with corporate America, Fortune 500 companies to make their information governance programs more mature. That's certainly something that's a challenge at the state and local level, as well as at the federal level. And so that all informs the background of the specific initiatives that we'll now get into. NAGARA put out a strategic plan, 2018-2022, which is well worth looking at and seeing how it maps to the state government experience. And it really has sort of a tremendous amount of points in it that are worth considering. I'm just going to highlight what is in Strategic Goal 1. I'd make a note, I have this interest in these things, that the first goal and in big print in this strategic plan is making access happen. And so what NAGARA is saying, they're not just in the preservation business, they are very much wanting to provide access to the public. Now, those of you who've heard me before, over the last 20 years I've been giving talks, know that I have serious concerns about how access will be accomplished in the digital world in the future. And it's something that animates me. I get up every morning, I worry about it, and want to be a part of a conversation going forward about advanced search on that topic. But on these points, the bullet points, NAGARA is committing to that 82% of its holdings will be processed to enable discovery and access by the public, that 500 million pages will be digitized, that they'll provide next generation finding aids to 95% of its holdings. These are all terrific as goals, and there are other goals as sub-goals, and there are other goals in the strategic plan. So one of the reference points in the plan and is talking about transitioning to electronic records. The June 28, 2019 OMB NAGARA memo that David Ferriero signed off on as Archivist of the United States, M-19-21, is really key, and it is worth looking at. And whenever I speak at CoSA, SAA, ARMA meetings, I'm always saying, well, one should take a look at these federal memoranda that have government-wide effect of the executive branch and see whether they are applicable to state government. And this one has some very important milestones and markers here for an inflection point we're all in, which is a transition to electronic records. So there was a former 2012 Managing Government Records Directive that I'm sure people are aware of. I had a hand in it, and when I was still at NAGARA through 2013, I'm very proud of NAGARA for looking to the end of the decade. By the end of 2019, federal agencies would manage permanent electronic records. This particular goal of that prior memo was applying to born digital records. And so that set a marker for the future that agencies after that date would need to be thinking about whatever records that are in permanent appraised records would have to be eventually accessioned into NARA at some future date. So what happened next is that in this memo that was just issued in 2019 by OMB and the archivist, NARA has set a date, a specific date where they are essentially going digital with an asterisk about legacy stuff, but going digital. They're going to manage all permanent records in electronic form, and federal agencies are expected to manage their records to accession into NARA in electronic formats with appropriate data. It says to the fullest extent possible, and of course there will be exceptions. It does not apply, this 2022 mandate does not apply to permanent records accession or transfer before December 31, 2022. So there's a window here. But after 2022, agencies will transfer permanent records to NARA in electronic formats with appropriate metadata. I mean, that's a sea change throughout government. And there is this kind of proverbial tidal wave coming. Now, it's not all going to show up on December 31, after December 31, 2022. It will be over time because there is a lag traditionally with paper records, 30 years for NARA to get accessions. But whatever the time period is, whether it's a year later or 5 years later, or whatever the cutoffs of records coming in after 2022, well, NARA is open for the digital world, and that's a huge challenge, which they're going to face. So the memo goes on to say that federal agencies will manage all their temporary records. Permanent records are just a few percentage points of 1 or 2% of all of government records. But this is a huge challenge for agencies to manage all their temporary records in electronic formats or store them in commercial record storage facilities. And so the memo goes on to say that the federal government is essentially closing its agency-operated record storage facilities, and agencies will close their own agency-operated record storage facilities, transfer inactive temporary records to federal record centers or commercial records storage facilities by December 2022. And so there we are. So the memo sets forth a really big change for the way federal record keeping is going on. The memo also commits NARA to revising its records management regulations to transition to fully electronic record keeping. There's a September 2020 deadline to provide guidance on various sub-aspects of electronic record keeping, like formatting metadata transfer guidance. And they're going to provide, NARA will provide modernized processes to officially schedule, transfer, and accession permanent electronic records through electronic means. That's all a very large commitment by that memo, and we'll all be looking to see what kind of guidance NARA develops between now and 2022, and I'm happy to take questions on that. As part of that effort, the OMB NARA effort and the 2022 deadline is, in my view, a part of a larger strategy or framework that this administration, the presidential management agenda, and the federal data strategy are all about. And so I'm heartened to say that I saw, looking up for this webinar today, that a couple of NARA people are represented on the cross-agency priority team, the federal data strategy team that's in place. If you go to the website, if you type in federal data strategy, you go to the website, you'll see that there's a very broad mission statement. Mission statement is to leverage the full value of federal data for mission service and the public good. And the site has a number of other components to it, other white papers, other memoranda, one of which is an action plan for the federal government. And there are more than just the 6 here. There are actually 20 actions that are set out in the 2020 action plan that involve agency actions, community actions, and shared actions. Some of them are like, a couple of them that are like a repository of federal enterprise data resources and a data standards repository. So I recommend taking a look at these documents. And from my perspective, and now again, I'm speaking only for myself. My slides at the end say I'm speaking only for myself and not any firm or institution that I'm associated with. Maybe I should have said that at the beginning, but let me just give you my take on this, which is that I am a very strong advocate of incorporating the ethos, the wording of records and records management and information management when you're talking about data strategies. And so I will be looking forward to seeing documents from the administration and from NAGARA and going forward in future years that integrates these concepts. And that will be a theme for today too. So that's the fuller context of that. And I think it's a very important federal initiative to keep in mind, that there's a federal data strategy that does inform what it will be electronic record keeping, federal record keeping going forward. And one marker here, one prominent memo in that regard is that this next memo, M-19-23 of OMB, which is the first of 4 phases set out to implement what is the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act of 2018. That act that was enacted in January 2019 included as Title II of the Act an Open Government Data Act that set out a number of very important new elements that I think are have direct relation to federal record keeping. And so I urge everyone, just type in M-19-23 after the webinar and check out what is a lengthy memo with appendices, goes into great detail. What it sets out, first and foremost, is what's in the statute, the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act and the Title II Open Government Data Act, set out a statutory requirement that all agencies in the federal government have chief data officers. Chief data officers have the responsibility for data governance and life cycle data management at federal agencies. And so our key players, in my view, that need to be, he or she who is a CDO needs to account for the schema, the scaffolding of federal records, and also FOIA. And I'm hoping that there'll be that kind of interaction between traditional records officers and CDOs so that they're not siloed in different parts of the organization. Now, I don't know, maybe I should take it as a homework assignment from all of you, and you can, on the chat, you can let me know how many CDOs exist in state government and whether you have interactions with them. But I can tell you that in terms of the Federal Records Act, a large proportion of what would be considered data is covered under federal records, are within the scope of what is considered a federal record under 44 U.S.C. 3301. So it is, I would assume that you all also need to be thinking and are thinking about incorporating, having data strategies because data will be eventually coming into state archives. So anyway, CDOs seem to be an important new player in the space that's required by the federal law. And by definition, if they're interested in life cycle data management and data governance, they're going to be involved in record keeping. They should be, if they're not. So then there are other parts of the memo that talk about learning agendas of agencies. Learning agendas are essentially a schema where agencies identify and set priorities for what's called evidence building, but I would say it's our records about evidence that the government, the kind of activities that the government is going forth with, and data governance bodies. Now, this is very interesting to me, that there be a formation within each agency, ideally under the OMB guidance, of data governance bodies that are looking at life cycle data issues and include chief records person, chief records officer, a chief FOIA officer, a general counsel, and CIO, of course, and others that are essentially the equivalent of a C-suite in corporate practice, but with senior people or their delegates that are on this data governance body for each agency. Now, I don't believe many of these have been set up yet, but it will be interesting going forward to see to what extent federal record keeping and FOIA are incorporated in the overall thinking of these bodies. And then the memo talks about data and information governance best practices. There is a CDO council that will be for all agencies to participate in of their CDOs. So I would check this out. Am I saying it's a model for all 50 states? No. But it is something to be aware of and to have a conversation with people up the line, senior people at your agency or agencies at the state government level, to see whether there are points of tangency, there are points that make sense as best practices to incorporate. Okay. So there are also new digitization standards that NARA has come up with. They're based on a 2014 Federal Records Act amendments at 44 U.S.C. 3302 that required the archivist to come up with standards for digitization. And if you go to the NARA website, you go here, and if you type in FAQ on digitization, you'll see that NARA has a very good set of responses and sort of captures what this initiative is all about. The digitization is really a step forward from existing policy guidance. There will be expected to be digitization standards for permanent records as well. And the whole point is that one needs to have an adequate way of going from original source records to digitized records. And you'll see in the FAQ, they get into the weeds, which is that the digitization initiative even has to encompass things like envelopes, cards, and sticky notes that are in the original source records somehow to be accounted for. So I want to throw that put that in as a marker here, and you should check that out as one of the new initiatives that are going on at NARA. Another initiative which is important is the Federal Electronic Records Modernization Initiative. And here, NARA has set out to provide a government-wide, cost-effective, interoperable set of records management solutions. And if you drill down at it, there are parts of this that talk about federal business capabilities, and in the weeds about records capture, maintenance, transfer, validation, migration. So there are spreadsheets and documents that are involved in this. It's all to be part and parcel of a procurement and an implementation of electronic record keeping solutions. And so I urge all of you listeners here to take a look at the FERMI documents. There is a FERMI use case for electronic messaging that's been developed, and I assume there'll be additional use cases in the future. So with that, I will turn to email. Email has been a problem for the federal government since the 1980s and 1990s. There's been waves of litigation, and the solutions to email have been long in coming, but now I think the problem has been largely addressed, if not almost completely addressed, with one asterisk, by what NARA has done in implementing the Managing Government Records Directive and something called Capstone. So there's been a requirement since December 31, 2016 for all email records to be managed electronically in agencies, no more print to paper. Query whether that's the default policy still in many states. We should have a conversation about that. That would be of interest to me as to how many states have moved beyond a default to print to paper. starting around 2016 and going forward, the analysis that NAGARA has done in terms of its collection of federal agency, senior agency official reports is that the prior directive was changing the landscape in terms of going from paper-intensive processes to a digital government, at least with respect to email. And the Capstone policies, they're voluntary for agencies, but I believe on the order of 200 reporting components to NAGARA have adopted Capstone voluntarily. And what it is a policy that is disruptive for email. It is one that carves out of existing record schedules by record series, email and attachments, and assigns email's retention period, appraisal period, as permanent or temporary based on role-based notions. So if you're a senior official, the kind of person who's senior executive in the senior executive service or at a high level of an agency, you will be likely tagged as a Capstone account holder by the agency, put on a form, reported to NAGARA, and if you are a Capstone official, then you will have all of your email in your inbox, sent or received, deemed to be permanent. Now that agencies can do a little bit of configuration here, and it's not a ironclad policy for every email, but it is the default here on the policy is that by role, senior officials, all email deemed permanent. Everyone else's deemed temporary, where program records, substantive records would be preserved for 7 years. And so from an IT perspective, you're saving 100% of email, but you're saving only a portion of it permanently, most of it temporarily. And so the approach addresses what were long-standing deficiencies, at least in my mind, in terms of compliance with email, and that it preserves permanent email and then disposes of the rest, but it disposes of email in 7 years under a general record schedule, which I'll in the next slide. But and that's important because you have FOIA requests and you have other reasons to preserve what might not be the most interesting emails from a policy perspective, but they may be of interest to individuals with respect to EEOC or MSPB or any kind of grievance or Title VII claim or whatever. There is a general record schedule that was developed for email so that agencies don't have to do their own schedules. And as I said, so there's permanent accounts, there's temporary accounts, and agencies have to submit a form listing all of their Capstone account people, senior officials, and then that gets signed off and from there. So so the percentage of Capstone accounts, what I would want as a takeaway from this conversation here that we're having is that everything is preserved in the short term for 7 years, but only a sliver of email is preserved permanently. It's not as if everything is preserved permanently. We're not in that. I mean, there's still an adherence to the objective of records management, which is judicious preservation of records, not everything. But for 7 years, what you've done is you've mitigated the risk. If you're an agency that is preserving all email, you've essentially taken away the controversies that have bedeviled certain federal agencies in the past where email cannot be found because it was not printed out and it's no longer available, and there are problems with network drives or shared drives or whatever. So in theory, an agency's email and attachments are now all searchable for FOIA, although that's the asterisk I'm talking about, which is that when you accumulate millions of records, we all know that there are search issues involved. Capstone has not, to my knowledge, been widely widely adopted through all 50 states at any, certainly not. But there are a couple of places, and one to look at is in North Carolina particularly, where that policy is at least being discussed and implemented in its own fashion. And so I would check that out at the state level, and I'm happy to have a conversation offline with people. And of course, you should feel free to talk to NAGARA people as well. But happy to talk offline about the pros and cons of adopting a Capstone approach. Let me say that there's a huge amount of email that is now being captured by Capstone, and so let's put that as the default baseline here. However, there is a policy question which arises given recent controversies in government as to whether the adoption of a Capstone policy will influence the behavior of some individuals to basically not use email and to use some other type of workaround. And we'll talk about electronic messaging next. But that's a query. I think my experience, this kind of question was asked in the 1990s about White House email being preserved. Since 1994, White House email has been preserved. And the question that arose is, oh, well, will people abandon using email? And the answer overwhelmingly is they haven't. That NARA has something on the order of 500 million White House emails. And everyone at the White House is on notice that their emails are going to be archived. And so I'm not sure that Capstone alone will change the behavior of a whole lot of people in terms of not using email. I think email is still a predominant communications platform in the federal government. But, it's a question that's worth thinking about. Okay, so, and now I want to turn to electronic messaging. The fact is that there's a real difference between what I'm going to talk about, which is ephemeral and self-destructing messages, and email. Email used to be the new thing, but of course we've all gotten used to it after 30 years. And there's a lot of redundancy in email. There's a lot of the fact that it accumulates and it's hard to get rid of. There are multiple copies, all sorts of places. And it's very different, even though it's not like traditional memos and not like traditional other forms of records that some of us were aware of, but, growing up and in our early careers. But the fact is that it's still relatively sticky. It's relatively permanent. It's on backup tapes. It's everywhere. And as I said, White House emails have been all deemed permanent by law since '94. There have been some missing email controversies, but as I said, at the end of the day, huge amount of email records preserved at the National Archives from the White House and now across government because of the directives, the 2012 directive and now the 2019 transition to electronic government memo. But here we are at a juncture, and I wanted to raise it as one of my hot button issues for federal record keeping, for state record keeping, corporate, whatever, is electronic messaging. And so the amount of messaging taking place is going up tremendously and all around the world. We live in a world where all of these types of apps are ones that not just our children use, but we increasingly use in workplace settings. I'm not saying that everybody does, but some people do, and not everybody uses each one of these. And of course, whatever your favorite app this year is will be replaced by another one next year. And so this list will be more or less out of date, as time goes on. But there are certainly arising controversies about the use in state government and elsewhere around the world about electronic messaging apps. We see this in Missouri, where there was a controversy over the governor and a whole set of other individuals, 27 members, using Confide, which is a way to do electronic messaging that is where there's a default of self-destruction of the messages. Not just Missouri, it's really all over. I only had a couple of sides here. Iowa, there's a Long Beach Police Department, there's state of Washington, there's any number of other jurisdictions where similar controversies. In fact, I could have put up a whole set of slides about in Australia and in Canada and in England. Across the world, there are these controversies where senior officials have used some kind of texting or a commercial email service as workarounds or, for whatever purposes to do government business. And we also know from the Mueller report that there are issues that go beyond just the civil context, the possible criminal context, that there's the Mueller office learned, special counsel learned that that there were communications during the relevant period that used applications that featured encryption or do not provide for long-term retention of data. And so they couldn't rule out the possibility that if they had copies of those messages, they would shed additional light in the report. And messages are like what we saw later in the context of Ukraine, is, you know, a set of texts that frankly do not have the kind of robust metadata that NAGARA requires for email, or that we would all consider to be a complete or comprehensive government record. And yet some of the most important conversations going on, not just in the current, in that context of Ukraine, but across government, are in messaging apps. And so it's important to note that there's been a recent case which challenged the White House failure to preserve Confide and Signal messaging apps, and the district court did not rule on the merits. The district court dismissed the case because said that the public interest group didn't have standing to sue the president to micromanage the president's record-keeping policies. But the court did say that the use of automatically disappearing text messages to conduct White House business would almost certainly run afoul of the PRA. That sentence would apply to the federal record-keeping context across all agencies. I can't help but note that the D.C. Circuit on appeal also said that Richard Nixon could only have dreamed of the technology at issue in this case, message deleting apps that guarantee confidentiality by encrypting messages and then erasing them forever. So those of us who remember Richard Nixon, well, there we are. Okay, so CoSA, NAGARA, and SAA have all issued a joint statement. They issued a statement actually years ago on email. I had the privilege of being asked by Barbara and others to tweak, helped at least to propose a tweak to the prior statement, and to say that, to add the point that government email accounts or other forms of commercial electronic messaging apps and services are at issue here, and that public officials should use official government accounts and not unofficial ones, that it violates the transparency and openness that the public requires of government to, and the fact that public officials are not being held accountable if one uses these other forms. They do mix government and personal records, and jeopardizes the accessibility of archival records. And so I think it's a very important statement. I think the statement actually should be translated into policy at the state level, and we should all be kind of promoting that. I think that would be a role for CoSA and for other records groups, archives groups. There is a footnote in this joint statement that that CoSA recognizes that in a mobile world there are exceptional circumstances. There may need to be a resort to commercial email and electronic messaging, but everybody should understand that their obligations take reasonable steps to forward or copy the communication to a government account. It's not the use of the messaging app per se, it's the failure to account for it, to ensure that it becomes a government record. If it's just sitting on a mobile device, it's very difficult for FOIA or for record keeping to ever get it in a system. You have to do something. And in fact, there is recognition of this. There's a statutory recognition in existing law that was passed in the 2014 amendments to the Federal Records Act. At 44 U.S. 2911, there's a corresponding provision for the White House, Chapter 22 of Title 44. But here, what is set out is a disclosure requirement for official business conducted on non-official electronic messaging accounts, where there's a forwarding requirement or a copying requirement in 20 days. And interestingly, you see that the provision does not say email, it says electronic messages. It says term electronic messages means electronic mail and other electronic messaging systems that are used for purposes of communicating between individuals. NAGARA has issued some guidance in a bulletin and elsewhere that that makes it clear that texts and forms of electronic messaging are covered by this. I haven't seen regs yet on the topic, but this is something that I have advocated should be thought about in terms of being widely adopted at the state level, something the equivalent in state law or policy that makes it clear that everyone is required to copy or forward messages. Now, that's easier said than done. There's a technical aspect of this I'll cover in just a second. But the guidance for state agency actors, the 2 points I would say is unless prohibited by state law, using these apps is not a per se violation, but you must copy or transfer. And you should also be using these sparingly. It's not like your default messaging or communication system. And also at the state level, this isn't really applicable to federal record keeping, but at the state level, there may be other reasons, related to elections or campaigns, that it may be appropriate to use these forms of apps. There's an information governance lessons here. We will all use, not just electronic messaging, this applies to across any new technology at the state government level going forward. We could have this slide, for the next 10 years or 20 years or whatever, the rest of my career. My career will be shorter than that. But information governance lessons here are that any new technology is going to be used by us, and it really shouldn't be prohibited. We need to figure out strategies for using efficient technologies, not shutting it down. We're going to expect that people won't comply with record keeping unless there's some automation aspect to it and make it easy for them to comply, whether it's email or anything else. I think there'd be mutiny if you locked down, you prohibited people from using what they want to use. So we need to figure out to be smart in this space. And whenever we've confronted novel communications, there's always been a gut reaction by officials to say, okay, the new technology is prohibited. Don't use it for official business. It should be, in my view, my view, we should caution people and try to figure out strategies for compliance and for whatever we're talking about. And there are exceptional circumstances, as CoSA notes, for ephemeral messaging. What I want to say, and I don't have the time here to do so, but there are technical solutions to electronic messaging that should be considered, where there's basically technology to allow for transfers of messages. There are certain apps that have end-to-end encryption that can be used so that if installed within the enterprise, people can use these new technologies, but also that the enterprise itself can be archiving them. Okay, so that's what I'll say about that. And in the short time left, let me just go through what I have here. The FOIA Advisory Committee that I sit on is a 2-year deal, and it is part of and run by the Office of Government Information Services at NAGARA, which is an ombudsman for FOIA. I was privileged to be co-chair of a records management subcommittee to this term's advisory committee, and what we are recommending to the archivist, you can see it online at the minutes of meeting where I have the URL here, is that federal data strategy with respect to CDOs and record keeping strategies be aligned. Essentially that CDOs, the CDO of NARA and the CDO of other places really, speak up about data and records being thought of in the same breath, not as siloed different entities. That records management materials be made available by links on FOIA websites. Query whether that's true at the state level, whether your record schedules are linked to a FOIA page, an FOI page, or a request for records page website. That there should be training for FOIA people on records management principles so they know what's going on at the federal level. That's especially important for Capstone. Then there's a whole range of e-discovery tools that are out there to enable efficient searching through larger and larger collections, repositories of electronic records. And so that's really important. And so we're pushing that as a recommendation that the FOIA community in particular learns that, and records management people too, to the extent that they assist on litigation, investigations, audits. They should really step up and if an agency doesn't have advanced tools, have a conversation about that. And then I'm also recommending that the whole field of AI and record keeping be looked at by the archivist and other components at the federal level. And I think that's for the future for the state level. Questions for CoSA. So here we are. Do you believe your state agencies are on track to manage born digital records? There's a 2022 deadline at the federal level, but where will you be in 2022 or 2032? How will electronic records be managed? Number two, will state agencies be able to digitize permanently appraised records? How about email? What issues are arising? Should Capstone be adopted? Sorry, there's not a 4. I took it out. 5, does your agency or state agencies employ any kind of e-discovery tools like I was talking about? If not, we can have a conversation about that. Do you think key people at your agency understand that data is could be records, it could be FOIA, and what training is needed? And is there a C-suite person? Is there some information governance champion who cares about record keeping and information governance? It could be general counsel, it could be CDO, it could be a chief financial officer, whoever. So those are questions. There's a whole set of new technologies that we're all confronting, both in the corporate world and in the public sector world. Vermont has been a leader on blockchain with the pilots, and there's legislation. So that's one form of record keeping that we may see. And beyond that, there are, hold on, let me see if I can do it. Certainly at the state level, there are body cameras and the whole body of evidence, or I guess there's a whole universe of photos and audio and video that need to be considered as records of at the local level at least, and maybe at the state level. And then there's the Internet of Things, where every device in the world is transmitting data, and some of that data is coming into agencies, either as an industrial matter like energy grids or farm data or whatever, that may well become the records of the future, or at least part of them. And there's a world of AI and a world of other things coming. So, we have a lot on our plate. I think culture change is possible. I'm being a little bit, I'm trying to be amusing here to say, even in government agencies, I understand the challenges, the resource constraints. I spent 33 years. I understand it. But I think as NAGARA has demonstrated leadership on, there are opportunities here for archivists and records people to step up if you want to recommend what are best practices in the space, at least to be part of the conversation when there are procurements going on or otherwise where you need to have a seat at the table. And that's something that I've been on my hobby horse for many years, soapbox or whatever, saying that records people and lawyers need to be there with IT people when they're at the start of a procurement. If they're thinking about a migration to some new platform, whether it's Microsoft 365 or the next new thing, how do you build in record keeping? How do you at least account for it? How do you figure out an archiving strategy so that make it easier for state records be accessioned into state archives? So I think culture change is a big thing, and we all have our part to do to be leaders, and we can't prohibit progress. Putting our hands up to the tidal wave that's coming. The digital world, is all around us and will be for the rest of our lives. And so to the extent we're working on these things, we need to embrace it. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Lisa, and I can see some questions too. But Lisa, if you want to take over, I'm happy to field whatever's come in.
Amazingly informative presentation. I know my head's spinning. I'm sure other people are going, oh my God, we've got a bunch of stuff to look through. So we do have some questions, and I'm going to start with, there's been several in the chat. And so I want to start, Alan Kwan asked a question about CDOs, and he was wondering if you had spoken with CDOs to get their perspective regarding M-19-23 and their role in managing data.
I have not. I've been worrying about other things in the 6 years that I've been outside government, but I think it's a very good point. And what I would encourage is that you speak to the CDO. not necessarily today, take a break. Tomorrow, call somebody up and who's a counterpart in state government. There may be a CDO, or have a conversation with people at NAGARA about their experience with CDOs and see if they get it.
Okay. So maybe the first thing would be to find out if you even have a CDO.
Right. I defer to others on the phone call here, and I'd be very interested in doing a survey. CoSA should, as to what is out there in terms of the state and local landscape for CDOs. It's a new thing in the federal government.
Okay. Well, we have another CDO question from Liz Moore. She wants to know if CDOs have records management and archival knowledge, or are they just looking at data primarily from an information management perspective?
Well, of course, you're right that this is the problem. This is why I'm recommending, or we're recommending at the FOIA Advisory Committee that the CDO of NAGARA, who will, of course, be immersed in the archival world, bring that knowledge to other CDOs, and so that it isn't first on any CDO's mind. I can assure you that they were not hired to do records management. They were hired for data quality, data integrity, and data efficiency, and dealing with databases and the web, and getting as much transparency in government as possible. But of course, underlying it is records. And so for all the reasons I said, I think there's an education process, and I'm glad NAGARA is participating in the federal data strategy. I hope their CDO acts as a liaison to this larger world.
So you're sounding like we need to take a CDO to lunch and have a conversation and realize there's more commonality than not between the two entities.
It's probably, I don't know which you all would rather be, a lunch with a CDO or a lawyer. Pros and cons of each. Yeah.
Okay, well, we're going to switch gears here. Sophie Law wants to know about e-discovery. Her question is, if an agency transmits a Capstone account to NAGARA and the agency receives a FOIA request or a subpoena, who fulfills that request? Does NAGARA do it? Do they have that responsibility, or is it still up to the originating agency to fulfill that FOIA request or subpoena?
Well, it's true not just of Capstone, but all federal records that agencies transfer records when they're at the end of their useful life to NAGARA, where there's essentially an agreement, used to be a 258 form, but electronically, that says that NAGARA will take legal custody of these records. So until that transfer happens, then the records are still the agency's and they're FOIA-able at the agency. Once the legal transfer occurs, however, and in Capstone it would be whatever, whatever number of email records there are, 1 million or whatever there are, then NAGARA would have the responsibility to answer FOIAs directed at NAGARA for those records.
Okay, thank you. Another question comes from Veronica Bartzal. She's questioning, she said, is there a reason or a benefit for us to hold on to the term records management? Or should we move on as a profession to referring to our work as information or data management?
So I think that's an excellent point. I am sure that, for example, ARMA, a number of years ago, embraced information governance in the principles, and there's certainly a movement towards thinking about data and information in ways that are consistent with sort of the larger world federal data strategy. If the entire world is using information and data to describe what we know, at least some of it, as records and worthy of being appropriate for preservation as records, then we may all need to get with the program. However, at least insofar as it's the National Archives and Records Administration, not the National Archives and Information and Data Management Administration, we're still, and NAGARA is still, in the records business. The Federal Records Act hasn't been changed. But Title 44 of the U.S. Code is all about information management. and so OMB has responsibilities, and so is GSA. And so, the question is a good one. But what is, I think, more important than the nomenclature is that the skill set for records managers to be relevant is not taping up boxes and sending to a commercial data center, a data warehouse. The skill set of archivists and records managers in the future are the kind of issues that I think I'm talking about here. And so we need to, embrace whatever other people are using and then crosswalk to the records environment.
Okay, great. Well, I have one more question for you. Do you think that most federal agencies will be able to comply with the Archivist 2022 mandate?
So my cavalier answer will be, I think most will say they comply. I'm a little jaundiced, given my advanced age, that what is said on reports and sent back to NAGARA is always the truth. There are compliance issues. I think in good faith, agencies will try to comply with the 2020 deadline. They did what I think is a spectacular job of complying with the email deadline of 2016. Not everybody crossed the line on December 31, 2016, but the fact that hundreds of agencies have adopted Capstone, and the fact that, there really has been good faith. And so I think there is a good faith effort to comply, but there isn't a police force coming to arrest people if they're not complying. So they will do the best they can. And perfect is the enemy of the good. If we as records people, archivists, if we're getting a slew of records in that we wouldn't have gotten before in electronic form, let's applaud ourselves even if it's not perfect.
Okay. Well, I think that's most of our questions for today. And Jason, I want to thank you on behalf of CoSA for a very interesting and thought-provoking presentation and kind of a look into what's coming down the pike and kind of where we need to be considering things on a state and local level. So thank you again for this presentation.
Thanks. It's a privilege to be part of here.
Well, what we'll do here for the last few minutes of the webinar, just remind everybody that we hope you've enjoyed today's webinar, and we got lots more where this one came from. So CoSA webinar, and this topic will be MPLP. So again, I think that ties in hugely with what we just heard today. Sari also has another interesting webinar. So again, go to our CoSA website and you can register for any and all of those. Now, we always have upcoming events, and a couple things have been canceled, but things are still on the books, so watch your newsletters and the listservs for more information. Of course, none of this is possible without all of our sponsors, and here's just many of them, and we appreciate all of their support as we try to carry out the mission. We want you to stay connected and informed, and CoSA has a lot of ways to do that, so we hope you'll take advantage of all these different ways to stay connected now that we're teleworking, even more important. So we hope everyone does that. And finally, we really would like to get your feedback. And when you sign off, you'll be getting an evaluation. We hope you'll take a minute and answer it, because those questions help the Education Committee as they plan future webinars. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today for this webinar. Jason, thank you again. I hope everyone stays well, stays healthy, and I hope you end up finding joy in your telework. You guys have a great day. Thanks so much, and we'll talk to you all soon. Have a great day.